The wind scoured the valley white, carrying with it the sound of boots dragging across the frozen earth. A man loomed against the storm, his broad shoulders bare despite the lash of snow. His hair pale as drifted frost, though his face bore the deep lines of strength and years, whipped about him like a ghostly banner. In his arms he cradled a bundle swaddled in worn furs, a newborn girl whose faint cries rose and fell with the howl of winter. Every step he took left a cavern in the snow, as though the land itself could feel the burden he carried. His name was Chenoa, and though he had seen battles and storms, nothing in his life had ever hollowed him like the sight of his child starving in his arms. The town appeared through the white veil. Clusters of cabins huddled like frightened animals beneath the storm, lantern light bleeding through the cracks of shutters. A bell on the church tower groaned as it swayed in the wind. Chenoa's breath came heavy, clouding in the air, his chest bare and scarred, his skin dark against the whiteness around him. He did not slow, though every eye that glimpsed him from behind frosted panes widened in suspicion, fear, and something uglier. He was an Apache, and worse still in their eyes, a giant of a man whose presence whispered of violence even as his arms were full of innocence. At the door of the boarding house he paused, pressing his lips to the infant's forehead, whispering words in his mother tongue, a prayer no one in that town would understand. Then, with a fist large as a mallet, he knocked. The door creaked open and warm air, rich with the smell of stew, rushed against his face. Figures gathered behind the threshold. Farm wives in shawls, merchants, and curious children tugging at skirts. Clara Wren, the matron of the house, peered up at him with sharp eyes that had never once softened toward a stranger. "What business have you here?" she snapped, her voice thin against the roar of the wind. Chenoa lowered his head, his deep voice trembling with a plea that cost him every ounce of pride. "My baby needs milk." He shifted the bundle, revealing the tiny wrinkled face of the child, her lips pale, her cry no stronger than a whisper. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Someone hissed that he should go back to where he came from. Another muttered about danger, about savages bringing ruin. Yet in the midst of those harsh whispers, one figure stirred. Evelyn May stood near the back of the crowd, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. At 22, her beauty had long been a subject of gossip, though these days it was spoken of in pity, for she had been left alone after her husband's death. Her in-laws had cast her out, saying she was a burden with nothing to offer. Since then she had lived quietly at the edge of town, surviving on little more than scraps and her own endurance. Her heart had known the sting of rejection, and that pain made her see the desperation in the man's eyes for what it was. Something human, something she understood. She stepped forward, though the crowd tried to hold her back with mutters of shame. "Let me see the child," she whispered. Her voice, though soft, cut through the noise like a knife. Chenoa lowered the bundle into the light. Evelyn's breath caught. The baby was no more than a week old, her skin mottled with cold, her tiny fists trembling as if the storm lived inside her veins. Evelyn's hand lifted of its own accord, brushing back the fur to uncover her face. She felt the pull of instinct, the ache of mercy. "I can feed her," Evelyn said, her cheeks flushing hot against the cold air. Behind her, Clara gasped as if struck. "You'll shame yourself before God and man," the matron spat. "Don't you see what they'll say of you?" But Evelyn's gaze never wavered from the child. She drew the baby into her arms, the warmth of that fragile body searing against her chest. Without another word she turned, carrying the child into the dim boarding house. The whispers rose to a hiss behind her, scandal laced with fear. Chenoa followed, his towering figure casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The townsfolk shrank back, parting like reeds before him. Evelyn settled into a chair by the fire, drawing the shawl tighter around her as she brought the infant to her breast. Silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of the child sucking, faint but steady, like the first fragile notes of a hymn. Chenoa stood apart, his hands hanging at his sides, scarred and trembling. He had fought men with rifles and storms that would tear roofs from cabins, but he had never felt so utterly powerless as he did in that moment, watching a stranger save his daughter. A tear, sharp and hot, cut down his cheek before the heat of the fire could dry it. Evelyn glanced up at him once, her eyes wide with both fear and something softer, something she could not yet name. She saw the shame in his bowed head, the weight of pride broken for the sake of a child. And she understood. Outside, the storm raged harder, as if the world itself disapproved. Clara Wren whispered to those nearest, her tongue quick with poison, that the widow had lost all decency, that she had tied herself to a savage. Rumor would spread before dawn, staining Evelyn's name deeper than the snow ever could. But within the circle of firelight, another truth took root. The baby drank greedily, strength returning to her tiny body with each breath. Evelyn's hand stroked her cheek, steadying her. Chenoa's chest rose and fell like a man who had been drowning and at last found air. When the infant released a soft sigh, milk-drunk and peaceful, Evelyn pressed a kiss to her brow. Then she lifted her eyes once more, meeting Chenoa's gaze across the small room. It was the first silent tether between them, a fragile thread spun from need and mercy. The baby stirred again, and Evelyn whispered, almost to herself, "She'll live now." The words were not meant for anyone, yet they filled Chenoa's ears like a promise he had not dared to believe. The room grew restless with judgment, but Evelyn rose, still cradling the child, and moved toward the door. "Come," she said softly, her eyes flicking to him. "This fire's not theirs to share. If you want her safe, we'll keep her warm at my place." The door opened, letting the storm rush in again. Gasps followed her, the murmurs of condemnation swelling like a tide. Chenoa lingered for a moment, towering above them all, his jaw set, his chest bare against the storm. Then he followed her into the snow. Lantern light faded behind them. The path ahead was dark, the world hostile, the judgment of the town already taking root. Yet between them lay the child, fragile as a flame cupped in trembling hands, and that small life bound them tighter than any vow. In the distance, Evelyn's cabin waited, a single window glowing faintly against the white expanse. As they trudged through the storm, side by side though neither spoke, the weight of what had just begun pressed heavy upon them. For the town would not forgive, and the storm would not relent. And somewhere in the silence between them, shame and mercy braided together into the first threads of a bond that could either save them, or destroy them. The cabin crouched at the edge of the valley, half buried in snowdrifts, its timbers groaning beneath the weight of winter. Evelyn pushed the door open with her shoulder, the newborn pressed close to her breast. The warmth inside was faint, just the glow of a single ember in the stove, but compared to the storm it felt like mercy itself. She moved swiftly, tucking the child into a cradle made from an old basket lined with scraps of wool. The baby stirred, cheeks flushed now with milk, tiny lips searching even in sleep. Chenoa followed, ducking beneath the lintel. His height filled the doorway, his presence crowding the room, though he carried no weapon and spoke no word. He stood in silence, his bare chest streaked with melted snow, his hair dripping against his shoulders. The firelight caught the pale strands, making him look like some figure carved of both shadow and frost. Evelyn's breath quickened. She had invited him, yes, but now in this cramped room, the risk of what she had done pressed upon her like a weight. Still, she busied herself with the small comforts of survival. She struck flint against steel, coaxing the embers into flame. The stove hissed, swallowing kindling, and the glow spread across the walls. The cabin revealed itself in pieces: shelves of chipped crockery, a quilt patched too many times to count, the wooden floor scarred by years of use. All of it bore the marks of solitude, and now of shame, for she had been cast aside, left here to vanish into silence. Chenoa watched her without blinking, his eyes dark pools that seemed to drink every detail. She felt his gaze not as intrusion, but as weight, as though he measured not her form but her courage. To silence the tremor in her hands, she spoke. "There's little here. No more than scraps. But it's warmer than the street." Her voice faltered at the end, and she hated how fragile it sounded. Without reply, Chenoa stepped back into the storm, his figure vanishing like smoke. Evelyn's heart leapt in panic. Had he left? But moments later he returned, arms laden with firewood gathered from the drift against the wall. He set it down beside the stove and crouched, feeding the flames until the cabin breathed warmth again. She studied him then, the curve of his shoulders, the scars etched into his skin. They told a story she could not yet read, but one written in blood and years of endurance. He caught her eyes for a fleeting moment, and she looked away, heat rising in her cheeks. Silence reigned again, broken only by the crack of the fire and the soft murmur of the infant's breath. Evelyn drew a stool near the cradle, sitting with her hand on the baby's brow. Shame pressed at her ribs, the weight of every whisper that would bloom come morning. She could hear Clara Wren's sharp tongue already, the widow who gave her breast to a savage's child. The thought made her close her eyes tight, as though shutting out the world could stop its judgment. Yet when the baby whimpered, she leaned close, murmuring lullabies she had not sung since her own brief days of marriage, before death had torn it all away. Chenoa, still crouched by the stove, reached into a leather pouch slung across his shoulder. He drew out a small strip of dried meat, hard as bone, and set it beside her. An offering. She looked at it, then at him. His hand remained open a moment longer before retreating to his side. She realized then that in his silence he was not proud but unsure, caught between gratitude and the shame of needing her mercy. Hours passed, the storm battering the cabin. Snow hissed against the shutters, the wind howled through gaps in the walls. Evelyn patched them with cloth, her fingers stiff from cold. Chenoa rose and joined her, pressing mud and straw into the cracks with rough precision. Together they sealed the drafts, working without words. For the first time in months, Evelyn did not feel entirely alone. When the task was done, they sat apart, the stove crackling between them. Evelyn stole glances at him. His head bowed, eyes closed, as though he carried not just exhaustion but centuries of loss. She wondered then what it meant to him to hand his daughter to a stranger, to trust her body to another's care. That trust pressed upon her heart with a strange weight. Burden, yes, but also a threat of honor she had not felt in years. The baby stirred and whimpered again. Evelyn lifted her, cradling her close. "She's strong," she whispered, almost to herself. "She'll live." The words hung in the dim air like a fragile vow. At last Chenoa spoke, his voice low and rough. "Her name is Ahiv." The syllables rolled like a stone across water. Evelyn repeated it softly, tasting the strangeness of it, yet feeling its warmth. Ahiv. A name that bound them all in ways the town would never forgive. The fire burned low as the night deepened. Evelyn's eyes drooped, though she fought sleep. The baby rested heavy in her arms, her breath soft as snow. She meant to lay the child down, but her strength failed. Before she could fall, Chenoa crossed the room and gently lifted the baby from her arms. His movements were careful, reverent, his massive hands cradling life as though it were glass. Evelyn watched, startled, as he tucked the child back into the basket, covering her with the quilt. He glanced back at her then, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes, gratitude mingled with fear, as if mercy was harder to bear than hunger. The storm raged, yet within the cabin the silence deepened into something almost tender. Evelyn leaned back against the wall, exhaustion claiming her. But her mind would not rest. Tomorrow, she knew, the world would shift. The town would whisper. Doors would close. Food would be denied. By taking in this child, she had stepped across a line from which she could not return. The thought chilled her more than the storm. She looked once more at Chenoa. He sat by the cradle, staring at the baby as though he could guard her from every shadow. His hair glistened white in the firelight, his chest bare, his scars stark. He looked like a man born of stone and storm, yet undone by something so small it barely filled the crook of his arm. Evelyn closed her eyes, clutching her shawl tight. She told herself she had done only what mercy required. Yet deep inside, another truth stirred, that this act had bound her to them both, not for a night, but for whatever days might follow. As sleep crept near, a sound tore through the storm, a knock at the cabin door, heavy and deliberate. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering. Chenoa rose in an instant, his hand braced on the doorframe, muscles taut. The baby stirred, whimpering again. Evelyn's voice caught in her throat. The storm outside seemed to hush for a heartbeat, as though the night itself waited for the next breath. Morning crept over the town in shades of pewter, the snow still falling fine as sifted flour. Evelyn stood at her window, shawl wrapped tight, watching the street below. Smoke rose from chimneys, boots stamped frost from steps, and voices carried in sharp bursts of gossip that cut even through glass. Her cabin, once unnoticed at the edge of the settlement, had become the eye of every whisper. The storm outside was no colder than the storm within, for word had spread. The widow had taken in an Apache giant and nursed his child as her own. She could feel it when she stepped out, a silence that fell where there should have been greetings. Women turned their backs at the well. Men glanced sidelong, muttering into their collars. Children pointed, snatched back by their mothers. Each gesture was a lash, stripping away what little dignity she had salvaged. Yet Evelyn walked on, her head high though her stomach churned, carrying a small basket to barter for flour. A hiv needed more than her milk. They needed bread, broth, warmth. Inside the mercantile, the air reeked of kerosene and leather. Behind the counter, Jedediah Pike leaned heavy on his elbows, his eyes glinting with something crueler than curiosity. He was broad and thick, a rancher whose wealth gave weight to his words. "Evelyn May," he drawled, loud enough for others to hear. "Didn't think I'd see you in here after last night's disgrace." Her hands tightened on the basket, but she kept her voice even. "I need flour, Mr. Pike. Nothing more." He chuckled, slow and mocking. "A white woman feeding a savage's brat? You'll find the Lord's house has no place for you now. Maybe you think yourself a mother again, but you're no better than the squaws." The words stung, not for their sound but for the heads that nodded around him, for the pitying glances mixed with contempt. Evelyn forced herself to breathe. "That child was starving," she whispered. "What would you have done?" Pike leaned closer, his breath sour with whiskey, though it was still morning. "I'd have let nature decide. We've no need for their kind here." His gaze lingered on her face, on the curve of her cheek, and there was hunger in it, ugly and possessive. "But if you're so desperate for a man, there are better choices than a half-naked savage in the snow." Evelyn's hand trembled as she set coins on the counter. Pike swept them away, tossing the flour down so hard the sack split, dusting her skirts. Laughter rippled through the store. She gathered the flour, cheeks burning, and left without a word. The cold air outside was cleaner, though it bit deep. She hurried back toward her cabin, shame clinging heavier than the snowflakes. As she neared, she saw Chenoa kneeling by the woodpile, splitting logs with measured strength. Each swing of the axe was silent determination, his breath clouding in rhythm. She paused, watching him. He did not look up, but she sensed he knew she was there, as though her presence stirred the air around him. Inside, the baby whimpered. Evelyn rushed to her, setting the flour down. Ahiv's cheeks were red now, her cries stronger. Evelyn lifted her, rocking gently, whispering soft words. The child quieted, tiny fingers curling around the edge of her shawl. That small grasp steadied Evelyn's heart more than any prayer. Chenoa entered, shaking snow from his hair. His eyes moved to the torn sack of flour, then to her flushed face. He said nothing, but the tension in his jaw spoke enough. Evelyn lowered her gaze, ashamed not of her choice, but of the ridicule she had endured for it. She longed to tell him, yet words failed. Days bled into one another, the storm relentless, the gossip relentless still. Clara Wren's tongue worked faster than the wind, weaving stories of sin and scandal. They said Evelyn shared her bed, that she had thrown away the last shreds of decency. No one sold her candles or salt. Children were forbidden to step near her door. Hunger sharpened its claws again. Yet within the cabin, a rhythm grew. Chenoa rose before dawn, hunting in the forest, returning with rabbits or sometimes nothing but frostbitten hands. Evelyn mended clothes with thread pulled from old garments, cooked thin stews, kept the fire alive. They rarely spoke, but gestures filled the silence. His hand steadying her when she slipped on the ice, her touch lingering a moment longer when she bandaged his cracked skin. The baby thrived, laughter replacing weak cries, her presence knitting them together in quiet threads neither could name aloud. One evening, Evelyn found herself laughing softly when Ahiv sneezed and startled herself, wide-eyed and indignant. Chenoa looked up from the cradle, and for the first time she saw a flicker of warmth in his expression. It was gone as quickly as it came, but it left her breathless. Still, shadows pressed in. Pike's threats grew louder. He cornered her again near the well, voice low but venomous. "You think you're safe out there with him? That child's just an excuse. Folks won't forgive. Sooner or later, the sheriff will be forced to act, or I will." His hand brushed her arm, rough and unwelcome. She jerked away, but his smirk followed her home like a stain. That night, Evelyn sat by the stove, the baby asleep in her lap. Chenoa worked by lantern light, mending a broken chair leg. She wanted to tell him everything, the threats, the fear, the way Pike's eyes had lingered on her. But the words caught in her throat. To speak them would make them real. Instead, she whispered, "They'll never let me forget what I did." Chenoa's hands stilled. He looked at her then, his gaze deep and unreadable. "They never let me forget either." The words, heavy with sorrow, seemed to shake the walls. Evelyn lowered her eyes, her heart pounding. She understood then that his silence was not emptiness, but a shield built from years of scorn. And in that understanding, she felt less alone. The baby stirred, her small cry piercing the quiet. Evelyn lifted her, soothing her back to sleep. When she looked up again, Chenoa's gaze had softened, though his face remained stern. A fragile bridge had formed between them, unspoken yet undeniable. The wind rattled the shutters, and Evelyn shivered. She pulled the quilt tighter, whispering more to herself than to him. "I'll keep her safe." Chenoa's voice came like a low vow, rough as gravel. "So will I." The fire burned low, shadows climbing the walls. Outside, the town whispered, plotted, judged. But within the small circle of light, mercy had become bond, and bond had become defiance. Yet even as that fragile peace settled, footsteps crunched in the snow beyond the door. A pause, then another heavy knock. Evelyn's heart lurched into her throat. Chenoa rose, towering, every muscle taut, his hand hovering near the axe by the door. The knock came again, harder, rattling the hinges. The baby whimpered, sensing the fear thickening the air. Evelyn clutched her close, her eyes darting to Chenoa. The storm outside had not ended after all, it had only changed shape, and now it stood waiting at their door. The storm eased for a time, but the cold deepened, sharp as knives against the skin. Days shortened into shadows, nights stretched endless, and hunger prowled like a wolf at their door. Evelyn woke to find frost feathering the inside of the windowpanes, her breath visible in the air. The baby stirred beside her, cheeks flushed but lips searching, and the sound of that fragile cry pressed against her chest like a prayer unanswered. She rose quickly, cradling a hiv, whispering promises she could not be sure of keeping. Chenoa had already gone into the woods, leaving tracks in the snow that led into the pines. He moved like a ghost, bare-chested despite the bitter air, a rifle across his back and a knife at his hip. He hunted not only for meat, but for the dignity that providing gave him. The cold bit at his hands until they bled, but he pressed on, following faint tracks, reading the signs of life in a world where most had gone silent beneath the snow. Evelyn waited by the fire, rocking the child, staring at the flour that dwindled each day, the broth that grew thinner with every meal. She thought of the market doors closed to her, of the whispers that followed when she walked into town. The shame pressed heavier than hunger, yet she would not bend. She would not abandon the child, nor the man who had placed her into Evelyn's arms as if trusting her with his soul. At dusk, the door opened, snow gusting in, and Chenoa stumbled inside. Across his shoulders lay a young deer, its body stiff but still a gift of life. His face was pale, his lips blue, his hands shaking so violently he could barely lower the carcass to the floor. Evelyn gasped, rushing to him, pressing her hands against his frozen skin. His chest heaved, every breath like glass tearing through him. She stripped the wet from his body, pulling the quilt from her bed, wrapping him as the fire flared. Her hands lingered against the scars on his chest, the cold biting through him, her warmth the only shield. He did not flinch, only watched her with eyes heavy yet alive, as though her touch itself anchored him to the world. When she pressed a cup of broth to his lips, he drank, trembling, but never looking away from her. That night, after Ahiv slept soundly, Evelyn tended his hands by firelight, smearing salve into the cracked skin. The silence between them was no longer fear, but something fragile, something unspoken. Her fingers brushed his, and he did not pull away. Instead he whispered voice hoarse, "You kept her alive." Evelyn swallowed hard, her heart aching at the weight of those words. "We both did," she said softly, though in truth she knew the cost he had borne in the woods, the price written in blood across his skin. Their eyes lingered in the dim light, neither daring to break the silence that deepened like a vow. As the days passed, the baby's laughter became their shield against despair. Ahiv's tiny hands reached for them both, binding them together with invisible threads. Evelyn found herself smiling more, though the shadows of gossip never left her mind. Each time she ventured into town for water or salt, Clara's tongue cut her, and Pike's eyes followed her like a hunter's, hungry and cruel. One afternoon at the well, Pike stepped close, his voice low and venomous. "That savage won't protect you when the town turns. You think you've found a family? You've only bought yourself ruin." His hand brushed her arm again, bold and threatening. Evelyn jerked back, her eyes flashing. "Better ruin with dignity than safety in your hands," she spat, her voice trembling but strong. She turned and left, but his laughter followed her like a shadow. When she returned to the cabin, her face pale, Chenoa read the truth in her silence. He said nothing, only lifted another log onto the fire, but his jaw tightened, and his hand lingered near the axe. Evelyn longed to tell him everything, yet feared what his fury might unleash. Still, when she laid the baby in his arms, his expression softened. He gazed at the child as though the world outside could not touch them so long as she breathed. Evelyn watched, her heart caught between fear of what loomed and hope for what blossomed within those walls. The storm worsened. Snow buried the path to town, food grew scarce, and yet their small sanctuary glowed with life. Chenoa repaired her roof, mended broken chairs, carved small toys from wood for Ahiv. Evelyn cooked what little they had, sang soft hymns, mended his torn leather. They spoke little, but every act became a conversation, every glance a confession they dared not voice. One night, as the wind roared and the fire burned low, Evelyn woke to find Ahiv crying, fever hot in her arms. Panic surged, for milk alone could not heal fever. She rocked her, whispering prayers, tears stinging her eyes. Chenoa stirred, his hand on the baby's brow, his face stricken with fear that no storm or rifle had ever drawn from him. Evelyn pressed the child against her chest, rocking until the fever broke near dawn. Exhaustion left her trembling, but when she looked up, Chenoa was watching her with a reverence that pierced her to the bone. "You would die for her," he whispered. Evelyn's throat closed, her tears spilling freely. "So would you," she answered. The truth hung between them, heavier than any vow. For the first time, he reached for her hand, his fingers rough, scarred, trembling. She let them twine with hers, and in that fragile moment something shifted, quiet yet irrevocable. But peace was short-lived. By week's end, footsteps crunched outside the cabin, louder than the storm. Torches glowed through the shutters, voices rising in anger. Evelyn froze, clutching Ahiv, as Chenoa stood tall, his body blocking the door, every muscle carved with defiance. The firelight flickered across his scars, across the axe in his grip. From beyond the door, Pike's voice carried, cruel and certain. "Come out, savage. We'll not let our town be shamed by you and the widow any longer." The baby whimpered, Evelyn pressed her face into her shawl, and Chenoa's eyes met hers, steady, unbroken. The storm had come to their door, not of snow this time, but of men, and there would be no hiding from it. The torches wavered like angry stars outside the cabin, their light cutting through the snow that swirled in bitter gusts. Shadows of men moved across the frost-glazed walls, voices snarling, fists pounding at the door. Evelyn held Ahiv tight to her breast, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The child whimpered, sensing the storm not of weather but of hatred pressing at their walls. Chenoa stood in silence before the door, the axe in his hand gleaming in the firelight, his chest bare, scars stark beneath the flickering glow. He looked like a man carved from stone, yet his stillness trembled with the weight of what might come. Jedediah Pike's voice rose above the others, sharp as a whip. "Send him out, widow. You shame us all by keeping him here. We'll drive him out, one way or another." His words carried the venom of a man who thrived on cruelty, his tone thick with the self-righteousness of the crowd. Murmurs followed, agreement rippling through the men like dry grass catching flame. Evelyn's breath caught. Her courage stretched thin. She pressed a kiss to the baby's brow, whispering a promise that no harm would touch her. Then, summoning what little strength remained, she stepped beside Chenoa. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, her hair loose around her face, her eyes fierce despite the fear inside her. She placed a hand upon his arm, steadying both him and herself. "You're not alone," she whispered. The door shuddered under another blow, snow spilling from the rafters. At last, Chenoa lifted the latch and flung it open. The storm swept inside, biting cold wrapping around them as the mob staggered back a pace at the sight of him. Bare-chested, towering, his hair white in the torchlight, he looked like some spirit of the storm itself, unbowed, unbroken. The axe hung at his side, not yet raised, but the power in his stance froze their jeers. Sheriff Callahan pushed forward from the rear, his face drawn with conflict. He raised his hands against the crowd. "Enough! You want justice? Look at the child." His voice carried above the wind, sharp with command. He pointed toward Evelyn, who stood framed in the doorway, the baby in her arms. "She's alive because of them. Alive because of her mercy and his strength. And if you call that shame, then perhaps you've forgotten what it means to be human." The mob wavered, murmurs shifting uncertainly. Torches hissed in the snow. Pike sneered, unwilling to yield. "You'd let a savage raise his child in our town? You'd let her?" His words cut off as Chenoa stepped forward into the snow, the axe planted deep into the earth at his side. He raised his voice for the first time, low and resonant, carrying weight like thunder. "I ask no place among you. Only that my child lives. Only that she be safe." Evelyn's voice, though soft, carried just as strong. "And she will. With me." The words spilled from her with a clarity she had not known she possessed. She lifted her chin, facing the torchlight and every eye upon her. "I chose this child. I chose this man. If you cast me out, so be it. But I will not turn from them." The silence that followed rang louder than any shout. The baby stirred, whimpering, and Evelyn pressed her close, her heartbeat steady at last. Callahan's gaze softened as he stepped nearer, lowering the barrel of the rifle slung across his shoulder. "Then let that be done," he said quietly. "This family has as much right to live as any of us." Some turned away in shame, others muttered curses, but the storm of anger broke apart like ice under thaw. One by one, torches dropped into the snow, hissing out, until only Pike remained, his eyes burning. But even he saw no victory in the face of their unity. Spitting into the snow, he stalked back into the darkness, his threats swallowed by the wind. The crowd dispersed, leaving only the hush of snow and the faint glow of the cabin behind them. Evelyn sank to her knees, tears spilling freely, though they were not of fear this time. Chenoa bent to her, his hand resting on her shoulder, steady and strong. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, and saw there not only gratitude but something deeper, something long buried that had been awakened by fire and trial. Days later, beneath a pale winter sun, Sheriff Callahan stood again at Evelyn's door, but this time not with warning or judgment. The cabin was quiet, the baby cooing softly in Evelyn's arms, while Chenoa stood beside her, solemn but unyielding. Callahan cleared his throat, his hat in his hands. "There's no priest left in town," he said gently. "But there's still the law. If it's your wish, I'll bind your names together. Husband and wife. Family, under heaven and earth." Evelyn's breath caught, and for a moment she feared to answer. Yet when she turned, Chenoa's eyes met hers, steady and certain, and the silence between them carried more than any vow. She nodded once, and he inclined his head in return. Callahan smiled faintly, speaking the words with the snow drifting down around them, the fire within the cabin crackling witness to their union. When it was done, Evelyn lifted her face to Chenoa, her cheeks wet with tears she did not try to hide. He touched her hand, rough and scarred, and she did not let go. Between them the child stirred, small and alive, aflame against the cold. For the first time since her exile, Evelyn felt not shame but dignity, not loneliness but belonging. The cabin smoke curled into the pale sky, a signal to the world that something new had begun. Outside, whispers would continue, judgment would linger, and danger might yet return. But within those walls, a family had been born not from ease, but from hunger and trial, from mercy given when the world refused it. And as Evelyn rocked the child that night, Chenoa seated beside her, their silence spoke louder than any vow. It was not a love forged in declarations, but in survival, in the steady strength of two broken souls refusing to let a flame be snuffed. Sometimes love comes not with firelight promises, but with the courage to stand before torches and refuse to bend. Sometimes family is not given by blood, but by mercy, by choice, by the stubbornness to keep one another alive. And it is in those choices, quiet and defiant, that the heart finds its truest home.